The sudden death of a president and his foreign minister is expected to send any country into disarray and chaos. But that's not exactly what happened in Iran after a helicopter crash killed President Ebrahim Raisi and Foreign Minister Hossein Amirabdollahian on Sunday. Raisi, a 63-year-old ultraconservative cleric, had once been seen as a potential successor to current Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei after being groomed for the title of president for years. He won in the 2021 elections, which had a record-low turnout. A high-ranking delegation was assigned by the Iranian Armed Forces chief to investigate the crash, which took place in terrible weather conditions, but begs the question as to why all these high-ranking officials were even allowed to travel in such circumstances. It has also brought up the issue of US sanctions and whether they're to blame for why Iran is still operating this very old US-made helicopter. So who's currently in charge of Iran? Who's going to be Raisi's successor? And what impact could all of this have on the foreign policy of Iran? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. This week, I'm joined by Director of Iran Project at the International Crisis Group, Ali Bayes, to break all of this down. First of all, I guess what everybody is asking is, why were all these really high-ranking officials on the same helicopter, on the same flight, in these terrible weather conditions? The weather was unstable and severe, and it seems that a civilian plane perhaps wouldn't have taken off in such conditions. So what do you make of those circumstances?
So we still don't know all the facts, and the Iranians are doing an investigation. But what we know is that these were three helicopters. The president and the foreign minister were in one of them. And apparently when they took off from the border between Iran and Azerbaijan, where Raisi had went to inaugurate a new dam, the weather was okay. And apparently the weather turned very quickly. And I think a combination of probably the fact that this was a almost 50-year-old American-built Bell helicopter and the sudden turn of events with the weather had resulted in this accident. But, if you look in the past 4 years, there will been more than 2,000 Iranians who've been killed in air accidents because Iranian fleet is aging, and because of sanctions, they cannot get spare parts. And so air safety in general in Iran is a problem. But one could say that, of course, putting the highest ranking officials of the country in an old helicopter in a weather like that was probably a irresponsible decision. But what has happened, and it's interesting that the Iranians have not, in general, talked about any kind of foul play here.
Who makes such decisions to put everybody in the same plane?
So again, not everybody was in the same helicopter. There were other ministers who were in other helicopters. And generally, U.S. president travels in 3 helicopters with his entourage, and it was the case with the Iranians as well. It's just a difference in circumstances and the technology that was deployed, and probably the presidential office made those kind of logistical decisions. I know that it's easy, especially in our part of the world, to buy into conspiracy theories that there must have been some kind of a bigger design. But again, this might also easily be interpreted as an accident.
We've been seeing mixed reactions, especially on what people call Iranian Twitter. Some people were actually celebrating the president's death and the foreign minister. But how have the reactions been inside Iran?
Look, President Raisi was not a popular character. He was not charismatic. He came to office with the lowest turnout in any presidential elections in Iranian history. And he became president only because all the other rivals were eliminated by the deep state in Iran, represented by the Supreme Leader and Revolutionary Guards, because he was a safe choice for them. And he, of course, was a product of Iranian judiciary. He had a long track record in repression, in killing dissidents, and especially in the recent movement known as the Mahsa movement, Women Life Freedom Movement. And it's completely understandable that people who were victims of his repression would celebrate his demise. At the same time, there is, without any doubt, 10-15% of the Iranian population who still believe in the Islamic Republic and are its core constituency. And those are the people who are mourning the loss of a president they saw very loyal to the system. So you have these mixed reactions. And of course, Iranians abroad, who in general dislike the political order in Tehran, are more on the celebration side than on the mourning side. But, at the end of the day, we have seen in government surveys, even in Iran, that there is 85% of the population that is dissatisfied with the status quo. And so that basically suggests that a lot of people would blame President Raisi for the worsening of their economic well-being and for the country's troubles. And that kind of, I think, explains the reaction writ large.
Who are the potential candidates that are likely to replace the president and the foreign minister? We've seen that there has been a caretaker president that has been appointed and a caretaker foreign minister that has been appointed pending elections. But who are people that are likely to replace the president and the foreign ministers? And what can you tell us about how this will change Iranian foreign policy?
Basically, Raisi's vice president, Mr. Mokhber, has been put in place as caretaker president, and Deputy Foreign Minister Ali Khamenei has been put in place as the interim foreign minister. There is no guarantee that they would be the next president and the next foreign minister. Once the country goes through the funeral process, which will come to an end in the next few days, I think you would see as early as next week candidates throwing their hats or turbans into the ring for the presidential race. And the likely candidates are all going to, I think, belong to the conservative camp. It's very hard to imagine that the deep state would allow the more pragmatic, the more moderate elements of the system run, unless they're safe bets in the sense that they know they're not going to be able to gain enough support. In the same way that President Raisi's election in 2021 had a more moderate figure as a rival candidate, but he was not well known and not charismatic and could not garner any significant votes. So that would be, if there is a more pluralistic ballot, I think it's going to probably be just for show, because the deep state in the past few years went through the process of consolidating power in the hands of conservatives to ensure conformity at the top of the political system, even at the price of the legitimacy from the bottom. And it has already, that's sunk cost for the Islamic Republic. I don't think they are willing to reverse course at this stage, because it's all about succession of the supreme leader. The idea is that the system does not want any surprises. It wants all loyal and subservient people in key positions so that the transition to the next supreme leader occurs according to the plans of the supreme leader. And that is why President Raisi was selected for this position. And that is why I think his death has thrown all of these plans up in the air. But that also means that the system will try to continue apace and would try to organize an election that would bring to power somebody who would also be a safe bet. And his foreign minister is going to be, again, very similar to the profile of Mr. Amirabdollahian, who was closer to the Revolutionary Guards than he was to the more traditional foreign policy circles in Iran.
So you're not expecting there will be a change in the status quo when it comes to Iranian foreign policy with the coming of a new foreign minister or a new president. I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, and you mentioned the supreme leader as well, the ultimate power does lie with the supreme leader and not then with the president. Is that the case?
That is absolutely the case. The supreme leader is the ultimate decision maker, but he has increasingly moved towards treating presidents as a glorified chief of staff. Presidents who have responsibilities and accountability without having power. The supreme leader holds all the power, and he wants presidents who would not challenge his authority. He has had, of the 5 presidents who've served under him, all of them have been a challenge except Mr. Raisi for different reasons. Either they were free thinkers like President Khatami, or they were troublemakers like President Ahmadinejad, or they were just challenging his every decision like President Rouhani. And that's why they've all been sidelined. That's why if you look at recent elections, whether it's been parliamentary elections or Assembly of Experts elections, the system has even disqualified its loyal critics or people who've been serving him for many years, whether it was Ali Larijani, former Speaker of the Parliament, or even President Rouhani, who was the member of the Assembly of Experts for 24 years, and yet he was disqualified and not allowed to run this time around. This is a closing of the political system because the primary objective, again, for the supreme leader is to be able to manage the transition to his successor without any serious challenge whatsoever. So I expect the next president, the next foreign minister, the next cabinet in general to also be quite pliant.
So basically, these elections are just for show?
Well, unfortunately, I think the Islamic Republic has emptied the institution of election of any meaning. The Republican part of the system has been completely undermined by the theocratic part of the system. And in that case, the elections are not going to reflect the will of the population. Now, they are important in another sense. They're important because I think even within the conservative camp, you would see fratricidal infighting because different factions will jockey for key positions in the government, of course, the position of the presidency. And the presidents are not irrelevant because they hold the power of the purse. They can inform policy, even if they are not, again, the ultimate decision maker or hold all the power. And the other reason is that it would actually give us a clue or a better sense of the balance of power still between the Revolutionary Guards and the Supreme Leader's office. Because, you would see in the choice of key cabinet positions, whether these are people who are closer to the Revolutionary Guards or could be considered closer to the office of the Supreme Leader, in which his son, Mujtaba, is a power wielder.
Will any of this have an impact on the war in Gaza, on the Houthis in Yemen, on Hezbollah, any of this at all?
Absolutely not, because those policies were devised, implemented, overseen by people who are still around and not by the people who were lost in that accident. In the sense that it's the supreme leader who decides about Iran's policy in the region and Iran's relations with its non-state allies, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, or the Houthis. And it's the Revolutionary Guards, and in particular the Quds Force, who's in charge of maintaining those relations and implementing those policies. And President Raisi had very little to do with any of this. And Foreign Minister Amirabdollahian was at best a spokesperson for it. And so their absence is not going to make any significant difference. But also at a strategic level, I think the Iranian system feels that it doesn't necessarily have a viable strategic alternative to its regional policy or its nuclear policy. And that is why, maybe in this turning point, there could have been opportunities for a new diplomatic outreach. But at this moment in time, and because, it has come in a year of elections, where a lot of other countries are dealing with elections, and so a lot of uncertainty, Iran did not expect that it would be in the same pool of countries going through elections, but it too is now inward looking. And at least for the next 2 months or so, the presidential elections are slotted for June 28th, but then they have to decide on the cabinet and get confirmation from the parliament. So it's going to be a period in which the Iranians also will be inward focused. And I don't see necessarily any possibility for change in a positive or in a negative direction. I think this overall means more continuity than change.
That's it on Beyond the Headlines. For more on Iran, head to thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Arthur Edison and Dua Farid, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher.